There are rock legends who spend their final chapters quietly fading into the background, content to let history remember them however it will. And then there is Michael Anthony, a man who spent 30 years holding his tongue, keeping his head down, and carrying the weight of untold stories on his shoulders. But at 70 years old, something shifted. Maybe it was the passage of time. Maybe it was the loss of Eddie Van Halen in 2020 that finally loosened the lock on decades of silence. Or maybe Michael Anthony simply reached the point in life where a man decides that the truth matters more than keeping the peace. Whatever the reason, what he has begun revealing, in interviews, in candid conversations with fans, and in the quiet spaces between carefully chosen words, paints a picture of Van Halen that the band's mythology never quite allowed the public to see. This is not a story about tearing down a legend. Eddie Van Halen was, without question, one of the most gifted guitarists who ever lived. His influence on rock music is immeasurable, and no honest telling of this story would suggest otherwise. But greatness and goodness are not always the same thing. And the story of Michael Anthony, the bassist who anchored one of rock's most explosive bands for over 3 decades, is a story about what happens when talent is taken for granted, loyalty is exploited, and a man's contributions are quietly erased while the world watches and cheers. At 70, Michael Anthony is finally letting people understand what it truly meant to stand in the shadow of Eddie Van Halen. To understand what Michael Anthony is exposing, you first have to understand what he built. When Van Halen exploded onto the national stage in 1978 with their self-titled debut album, the conversation was almost entirely about Eddie. And understandably so. His two-handed tapping technique and volcanic guitar solos were genuinely revolutionary, unlike anything rock audiences had ever heard. But underneath that guitar pyrotechnics was something just as essential, even if far less glamorous. Michael Anthony's bass playing was the gravitational center of Van Halen's sound. His low-end lines on tracks like Running with the Devil and Ain't Talking About Love provided the rhythmic bedrock that allowed Eddie's guitar work to soar without the entire musical structure collapsing under its own chaos. More than the bass, however, it was Anthony's voice that gave Van Halen its distinctive texture. His ability to deliver stratospheric high harmonies, night after night, album after album, across a touring schedule that would break most musicians, was arguably the most undervalued technical achievement in the band's entire catalog. David Lee Roth brought charisma and swagger to the lead vocal position, but it was Anthony's harmonies floating above and around Roth's voice that transformed Van Halen's anthems into something larger than life. Fellow musicians who worked alongside the band during that era consistently praised Anthony's vocal precision. Session musicians, sound engineers, and producers who were present during those recording years knew that the blend of Roth and Anthony's voices was not accidental. It was a carefully constructed and executed sonic signature that took real skill to produce and maintain. And yet, from the very beginning, Anthony occupied a strange position within the band's internal hierarchy. He was not a Van Halen by blood, and he was not Roth, the theatrical frontman who commanded the visual narrative of the group. He was the third wheel in a three-way power struggle he largely chose not to participate in. He showed up, he played his parts brilliantly, he hit every note, and he kept the machine running. For years, he believed that his professionalism and dedication would be recognized and respected. What he did not fully appreciate until much later was that in a band defined by ego and ambition, quiet loyalty is not always rewarded. Sometimes it is simply exploited. Perhaps the most stunning chapter in the story of Michael Anthony's relationship with Van Halen is what happened during the 1984 tour, arguably the band's commercial and cultural peak. The album 1984 had produced one of the biggest hits in rock history with Jump, and Van Halen were at the absolute pinnacle of their power. Behind the scenes, however, a very different kind of power was being exercised. According to former Van Halen manager Noel Monk, who detailed the incident in his memoir, Anthony was approached backstage just hours before a concert performance and pressured into signing a contract that stripped him of all future songwriting credits and royalties. The 3 other members of the band were present when he signed. What makes this moment so significant and so troubling is not just what Anthony lost financially, but the circumstances under which he lost it. He was not given time to consult a lawyer. He was not given the opportunity to negotiate. He was handed documents in a high-pressure environment, with the implicit understanding that refusing to sign could jeopardize the tour and his place in the band. So he signed, and in doing so, he forfeited his claim to the royalties and credits from one of the best-selling rock albums in American history. The album 1984 went on to sell over 10 million copies in the United States alone. The licensing revenue, the royalties from streaming, the revenue from reissues and greatest hits compilations, Anthony would receive none of it. His name would be absent from the credits that drove those earnings, despite the fact that his bass lines and vocals were woven into every track. At 70, Anthony has spoken about this moment with a measured clarity that only comes from years of having processed a deep wound. He has confirmed that the signing happened under duress. He has acknowledged that he understood, even in that moment, that what was being asked of him was fundamentally unfair. But he also admitted something that cuts to the very heart of his character. He signed because he wanted to protect the band. He believed, in that pressured backstage moment, that keeping Van Halen together mattered more than protecting himself. That single decision, rooted entirely in loyalty and love for the music, cost him a fortune and fundamentally altered the legal architecture of his contributions to rock history. And it was a decision made possible, in large part, because the people who should have protected him chose instead to exploit his trust. If the 1984 contract was the financial erasure of Michael Anthony, then Eddie Van Halen's public comments in the years that followed amounted to something perhaps even more painful, a personal and professional erasure. As Van Halen's fortunes changed through the 90s and into the 2000s, Eddie began giving interviews in which he characterized Anthony as a limited musician who required constant guidance. The most damaging of these came in a 2015 interview with Billboard magazine, in which Eddie claimed he had been forced to show Anthony every note he played and described him as lacking initiative and drive. The reaction from the music community was swift and largely dismissive of Eddie's claims. Musicians who had toured with or performed alongside Anthony pushed back against the characterization. The notion that a bassist who had delivered consistently precise performances across decades of live touring, while simultaneously singing complex high harmonies, somehow needed to be spoon-fed every note was, to many professionals in the industry, simply not credible. Anthony himself responded to the claims with a dignified but direct rebuttal. He stated clearly that Eddie's description of their working relationship did not reflect reality, that he had always learned the band's material independently, and that if such tutorial sessions had ever taken place, there would be evidence of them, and no such evidence exists. But credibility and emotional impact are two different things, and Anthony has since spoken openly about how deeply those public comments hurt him. These were not criticisms coming from a stranger or competitor. They were coming from a man he had known since his early 20s, a man he had stood beside on stage for over 30 years, a man he had defended and protected even when it cost him personally. To have that person turn around and use a national media platform to publicly diminish his abilities, that was a wound of a different kind entirely. Anthony described the experience as emotionally draining in a way that pure professional criticism never could be, because it was not really about musical ability at all. It was about power, and about a fundamental unwillingness to share credit with someone who had genuinely earned it. What happened to Michael Anthony's role in Van Halen through the late 90s and into the 2000s was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow, methodical reduction, a gradual dimming of his presence that unfolded over years, making it difficult to point to any one moment and say, that is where it happened. But looking back, the pattern is unmistakable. During the recording of the 1998 album Van Halen 3, Anthony played bass on only 3 of the 11 tracks. Eddie performed the bass duties on the remaining songs himself. Anthony was still present, still part of the band's public face, still appearing in promotional material, but his creative role had been quietly and substantially reduced. When the band released its 2004 compilation, The Best of Both Worlds, Anthony's only contribution to the new tracks was backing vocals. No bass playing. And when the reunion tour with Sammy Hagar that same year came together, Anthony was required to sign a contract that classified him not as a band member, but as a hired musician, with reduced financial compensation to match. According to Hagar, who has spoken about the arrangements from that period, Anthony accepted those terms because he wanted to be part of the music and maintain whatever connection to Van Halen remained available to him. He was, as he had always been, willing to accept less than he deserved in order to keep the door open. The final blow came in 2006, when Eddie Van Halen decided to replace Michael Anthony with his teenage son Wolfgang. By any measure, this was a significant decision, the removal of a founding member who had been part of the band's identity for over 3 decades. What made it particularly painful, as Anthony has since disclosed, was not the decision itself but the manner in which it was communicated. Or rather, the manner in which it was not communicated. Anthony did not receive a phone call. He did not sit down with Eddie or Alex for a conversation. He learned about his own replacement the same way fans did. Through the internet, through online rumors, through reading things on a screen that told him his chapter in the band he had helped build was over. At 70, he has said plainly that the lack of a simple phone call was one of the most hurtful aspects of the entire experience, not because it would have changed the outcome, but because after 30 years of loyalty, he deserved at least that much basic human decency. What the Van Halen story might have obscured, and what Michael Anthony's life since 2006 has made abundantly clear, is that he was never simply a supporting player waiting for someone else's permission to matter. His work with Sammy Hagar following his departure from Van Halen demonstrated, to anyone paying attention, that his musical instincts and abilities were entirely intact and that his contributions had always been genuinely substantive rather than merely decorative. Chickenfoot, the supergroup he formed in 2008 alongside Hagar, guitarist Joe Satriani, and Red Hot Chili Peppers drummer Chad Smith, was received with real critical and commercial enthusiasm. Their debut album entered the Billboard 200 in the top 10, and Anthony's bass work and vocal harmonies were central to the band's sound. Critics who reviewed those albums noted that Anthony's playing was confident, creative, and full of personality, not the playing of a man who had spent 30 years being told what notes to play. His subsequent work with Sammy Hagar and The Circle, which has released original music and toured consistently into recent years, has reinforced that impression further. At 70, Michael Anthony is a man who has arrived at something that resembles peace, not the peace of someone who has forgotten what was done to him, but the peace of someone who has decided that his identity is not defined by those injuries. He speaks about his Van Halen years without bitterness, but also without the carefully managed restraint that characterized his public comments during the band's active years. He is willing, now, to say clearly that the financial arrangements were unjust. He is willing to say that Eddie's public criticisms were false and that they caused real harm. He is willing to say that being replaced without a phone call was a betrayal of 30 years of loyalty. And he says all of this not to diminish Eddie's legacy or to rewrite rock history, but because he has reached the point where the truth simply matters more than the performance of peace. There is a version of Van Halen's history that has been told many times, and in that version, Michael Anthony is a pleasant footnote, the reliable bassist who kept things together while the real artists created around him. That version is wrong. The musical identity of Van Halen was not built by Eddie's guitar playing alone, extraordinary as that guitar playing was. It was built by the combination of 4 specific human beings, each of whom contributed something irreplaceable. The rhythm section of Anthony and Alex Van Halen was one of the tightest and most responsive in rock. Anthony's vocal harmonies were genuinely integral to the band's sound in a way that becomes obvious the moment you listen to those recordings with fresh ears and real attention. His contributions were recognized by the people who actually worked within the music industry during that period, by producers, by sound engineers, by fellow musicians who toured alongside Van Halen and watched Anthony perform night after night. The erasure of his contributions was not a natural historical judgment. It was an active and deliberate process, facilitated by financial arrangements designed to remove his stake in the band's intellectual property, and by public commentary designed to diminish his reputation. At 70, Michael Anthony is providing the corrective record that history has long owed him. Eddie Van Halen's brilliance is not diminished by acknowledging that Michael Anthony was treated unjustly. Both things are true simultaneously. Eddie was a once-in-a-generation talent. He was also, by the accounts of those closest to him, including his own former collaborators and family members, a deeply complicated and sometimes destructive force in the lives of those around him. Michael Anthony is not exposing Eddie Van Halen to tear him down. He is exposing the gap between the mythology and the reality, because after 70 years of living through that reality, he has earned the right to speak it plainly. When Michael Anthony picks up a bass guitar today and plays, the music carries everything. The joy of those early years in the Southern California club scene, the exhilaration of playing to tens of thousands of people at the height of Van Halen's power, the grief of a friendship and partnership that ended without resolution, and the quiet dignity of a man who refused to let bitterness be the last word. He has outlasted the conflict, outlasted the dismissals, and arrived at 70 with his integrity entirely intact. The story of Michael Anthony and Eddie Van Halen is, in the end, a story about what the music industry does to the people who make the music, how it elevates some and marginalizes others, how it rewards charisma over craft, how it allows power imbalances to fester inside creative partnerships until those partnerships collapse under the weight of unresolved injustice. It is a story that happens in every genre and every era, but rarely with stakes as high or a cast as legendary as this one. What Michael Anthony is exposing at 70 is not a scandal.